As a history teacher, I always begin my classes each year by asking students to go around the room and to introduce themselves to me. This is something I hated having to do when I was a student, but I must admit that now that I teach, it's my absolute favorite thing in the world. And I found that no matter where I'm teaching, no matter whether it's undergraduates or master's students, whether they're old or young, wherever they come from, this first day of class goes exactly the same way. I ask them to give them their name, their year of study, and why they are taking this class. And no one has a problem with those first two questions. But it doesn't take long for a student to start to struggle awkwardly while they explain why they are taking that class. To end their discomfort, I tell them that it's okay if the answer is, because I have to. Life is filled with requirements, I say, and it's really not going to hurt my feelings if this class is one of yours. With a sigh of relief, the student will admit that, yes, this class fills a requirement. And after this first admission, many more follow. I'd say, on average, the need to fulfill requirements generates approximately 3/4 of our history students today. But again, I'm not offended by this. Because over time I've learned the lack of enthusiasm for history has to do with a popular misconception about what it means to be a historian. Most students come to class on the first day armed with a stack of index cards, bracing themselves for the inevitable deluge of names, dates, and places that they think they will have to memorize. In response, I started beginning my classes by talking about the fact that history has very little to do with the memorization of such minutiae. And they quickly get the point after they realize how many names and dates I frequently forget. History, I tell them, is about making sense of stories, understanding the motives and intentions that came before us, and seeing how they shape our world. Now, it takes a few weeks for this message to sink in. But once students realize that being a historian isn't about memorization or minutiae, and that it offers them something of value for their lives, here and now, they begin to feel free and even excited to engage. As a history teacher, I find that the myths about what it means to be a historian make it harder for people to want to be involved. Dispelling these myths and showing students what it truly means to study history is the first step to getting them active in the world around them. In the church, I'm sad to say, I think we have a problem the opposite way. In the church, myths about what it means to be a Christian have produced some of the most active and engaged people in the world. When we wrongly think that Christian faith is achieved by being a good person, and that we earn God's love and grace with our good works, we can make ourselves surprisingly busy. There is a reason that the churches today which have the most money and the highest worship attendance are the churches that preach a gospel of prosperity. When we let ourselves believe that wealth is a measure of God's love for us, that the money we give to the church will come back to us tenfold, and that Christian faith is really just a divine rewards program, it becomes easy for us to get active in the world. But as we heard last week in the beginning of this sermon by Jesus, the relationship we have with God is not one of divine rewards. In fact, it's that relationship with God that Jesus comes to overturn. Jesus comes to us as the fulfillment of God's promise through Isaiah that the poor will be blessed, the hungry fed, and the oppressed made free. At the heart of Jesus' ministry is the message that God's love cannot be purchased by our wealth, our works, our prayers, or anything else that we do. He tells us that God does not love people because they are exactly who they ought to be, but that God loves people to make them who they ought to be. Yet when we hear this message, all of a sudden, we often seem to lose a lot of our motivation to engage the world around us and to care for the people we see. The hard reality is that when Jesus takes away the carrot and stick of divine reward and punishment, we realize just how much of our motivation to be good people was tied up in the idea of a reward. When Jesus told us that in God's kingdom the poor are blessed and the rich sent away empty, he didn't just show us that God cares nothing for our wealth. He took away our imagined spiritual kickbacks that we use to motivate our good works. In losing our false ideas about how God relates to us, we lose our system of understanding how we relate to one another. In the old system that we imagined for ourselves, we imagined that our relationship with God depended on our good works, and that God's love was a reward for good behavior. Consequently, we reviewed our relationships with one another as means to an end. We did good things for one another to curry favor with God. And if you're being honest with yourselves, as I am with myself today, this is a hard life to leave behind. And that's why Jesus follows the blessings and woes we heard last week with the admonitions that we hear today. And his infinite and divine wisdom, Jesus knew that the good news he brought would leave us adrift. He knew that we who had lived in bondage to wealth and works as a system of punishment and reward wouldn't know how or why to live once we'd been set free. And so now, in the second movement of his sermon, Jesus focuses on connecting our relationship with God to our relationships with one another. And then, at first glance, Jesus sets before us an image of a life that seems impossible to live. But what he's doing is calling us out for our old way of relating to one another. For our old way of living, we loved only those who found us lovable and who were like us. We did good only when we would receive material or spiritual good in return. Gave only when we knew we'd be paid back in full, or at least compensated with spiritual reward. Note how Jesus talks about this old life. He doesn't describe it as a life that everyone can live. He says that even sinners live this way. This is because this quid pro quo life is not one we live because it is an easy or kind life to us. No, living in a this or that world is a terribly difficult and demanding life to live. It brings out the worst in us and keeps us from ever truly loving one another. The wealthier our society has become, the easier this has been to see. For we live in a time where people are plagued by anxiety and doubt, all of which stem from the moral economy of these relationships. You cannot find a wealthy person who does not lose sleep wondering if they have any true friends, or if in fact everyone will depart them should they lose their riches. All of us, young and old, suffer from the depression and envy of the lives others pretend to live by the aid of social media. So many in our world today cannot conceive of God's glorious creation except as a thing to be exploited for profit, rather than stewarded and preserved for its own sake. To we who are trapped in such systems, it is impossible to love our enemies, to bless those who curse us, to give without expecting return. In the systems we experience today, such a life as Jesus describes here is beyond our grasp. It is inconceivable and foolish to our way of thinking. We are not able to live in that way as much as we might want to. The freedom to live this new life comes only in, with, and through the relationship of love that God forges with us. It is for this reason that Jesus always pairs the lives we are called to live with the love God has first shown us. Be merciful, just as your Father is merciful, he says. And in that one sentence, we have the entire sum of Christian living. For when we but for a moment contemplate with what mercy God has loved us, a mercy so great that God needs and asks nothing of us, for the first time we are able to imagine with what mercy we might love one another. Such a love for our neighbors is only possible because God first loved us. Through the cross, God sets us free from a relationship with God that is determined by our wealth and our works. This freedom cannot be contained by our relationship with God alone. As Christ describes it, the love of God is a good measure, pressed down, put in our laps, running over. And indeed, the love of God is too good a measure to be contained. It presses down on us, shakes up our way of seeing the world, and runs over, spilling into our relationships with one another and the world. We who have borne the image of Adam, the man of dust, as Paul says, will also bear the image of the man of heaven, that is Christ. By relating to us not by human works, but by divine love, God frees us to relate to one another as Christ relates to us. For when God needs nothing from us, there is no longer any cause to exploit one another or creation. Just as God wants neither our wealth or our works, but only us. God's love for us frees us to love without reward, to give without return, to do good in pure joy. Brothers and sisters, as impossible as it might seem, nothing stands between us and such a life. Whatever fears that once held us back are no more. Whatever bonds that once held us captive have been released. Whatever causes that once distracted us have ceased to matter. Before us today, by the grace of God, only one life remains, and that is the life of Christ in us, with us, and for us. It is not the life that we deserved, and for that, thank God. Now, let us do unto others as God has first done unto us. For the freedom of this wonderful life in Christ. Thanks be to God. Amen. Amen.